Hi, welcome back to Live and Breathe Horses. Thank you for joining me today for another fantastic story from Tom Dorrance, More Than a Horseman. This was collected and put together by his wife Margaret Dorrance and by John St. Ryan. So today's story comes from Thomas M. Pimentel. Pimentel. As I said in the last episode, I'm so sorry if I get people's names wrong. I do try to look them up and find the right pronunciation, but sometimes it's really hard to know. And it's where you put the accent, it can sound completely different. Thomas, today's story, is the son, sorry, son of Ethel, who we had her story last week. I was named after Tom Dorrance, just as my brother Bill was named after our uncle Bill Dorrance, all due to the respect and appreciation of my mother, Ethel, for the way that her two closest oldest brothers looked after her while she was growing up. Specifically, the first time I encountered Uncle Tom, as I remember it, was when I was approximately 5 years old. My mother and I rode the Greyhound bus from Hayward, California to Enterprise, Oregon, where I got to meet my grandfather, Church Dorrance. During that visit, Uncle Tom told us that grandfather would pay us a nickel for each mouse that we could catch. Well, a nickel in those days was big money. Each grandson had his own trap line of mouse traps set in the barn. Every morning we would check our catch, take it to grandfather and get her paid. While, well, being the inquisitive one that I was, I decided to cut open one of the mice only to discover that it had several unborn babies inside. I put them on a board and brought them to grandfather, and he asked Uncle Tom what he thought. And he replied, well, most of them would have grown up, and I'd say they're worth a penny each. He didn't even ask for a cut of the action. That was the same visit that the local rodeo was going on. After going there and seeing that I, at my young age, was pretty sure that I wanted to ride something wild. At the age of 5, Uncle Tom suggested that I start out with something less than a bull or a bronco. He clued me in that the 2 sheep that they kept in a corral near the barn often slept in the afternoon, and that I could sneak up on them and jump on for a ride. I felt so successful when I actually did sneak up and jump on. Well, the ride didn't last 8 seconds, but it seemed like an eternity, and boy, was that fun. Previously to that, I'd only been in the presence of my grandfather, along with my grandmother Minnie, as a baby, having been born in 1946 when my father, Colonel Merrill Pimentel, was in the US Army in the Philippines, making it necessary for my mother and my 2 older brothers and me to live at my mother's parents' ranch near Enterprise. Needless to say, that was a rough time for my mother, but it was made easier by the presence of my grandfather and grandmother, and of course, my Uncle Tom, who was still living at the ranch. The next time I encountered Uncle Tom was a few years later, when my parents and my brother Bill and I came to Enterprise for my grandfather's funeral. After the funeral, we had to get together down by the creek that flowed behind the ranch house. Before the lunch began, my cousin Skip Potter and my brother Bill, both of whom were older than me, had built a raft to float across the dammed up creek. I believe it was my cousin Karen's 8th or 9th birthday, and she was decked out in a party dress with a hoop skirt. Without my knowledge, the other boys had developed a mischievous plan. They knew exactly how much weight the raft would hold before sinking. They invited Karen to get on, and then they told me to get on. They pushed off, and the raft began to slowly sink. I vividly remember Karen screaming and the hoop dress becoming soaked. There was no danger to anyone, as the creek was quite shallow, but very wet. I never knew if Uncle Tom had any part in the planning of this caper, but it would not have surprised me. Uncle Tom always made me feel like he really liked me. I know my cousins felt the same way in his presence. I know he liked us because he always teased us in a loving way. After everyone recomposed themselves, someone noticed that Tom wasn't present. He was normally always there when there was food involved. He knew that he was up. We knew that he was up in the upper field, checking fences, etc. So someone went up there to look for him. It turned out that he'd been bucked off and had broken his leg. So he was taken to hospital and he was pretty upset when they cut his boot off. During Tom's later years, I had one special day with him. This was after he and Margaret moved onto the Dorrance Ranch in Salinas. For those of you who didn't know, Tom Dorrance was an inventor. He just had the ability to invent without any formal training. One of his inventions was the automatic gate. There are some of the finest, most useful gates ever built. Well, this day I mentioned was when I happened to be at the Salinas Ranch when one of Tom's gates had malfunctioned. It seemed that some of the large springs that he'd purchased were defective and had broken. While the spring company had agreed to replace the springs, there was still quite a bit of labour required in replacing those springs. At this point in Tom's life, he was nearly blind and had little strength. So he sat in the Jeep and gave me directions, step to step, on how to do the repair. When we got to the part where the springs had to be stretched, he told me to use the come along, at which point I suggested that since my Jeep had an electric winch, would it not be easier to use that to stretch the springs? He thought about it for a minute and then said, "Yes, good idea." We used it and it worked, and I think he realised that I may have inherited the same ability to invent. Wonderful memories. It's so nice, the family stories. They kind of have a different angle than the more horseman related stories. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to see you next time.